Present.
Lisa Daniels,
Here.
Chief Davis,
Here.
Marcus Stallone.
Here.
And then I will just do the rest of the roll in case I'm not seeing everybody. Kelly Cassidy, Ryan Spain, Robert Peters, Darren Bailey, represented by Colin Mosley. We know you're here, Colin.
Here.
Ari Jones, Scott Main, Sharon Mitchell,
I'm stepping up for Mr. Mitchell today, Jim.
It's going to be Jim Jacobs, Kathy.
all right. Jim, thank you for joining us.
Shoba just joined the room.
Shoba, nice to see you.
Hello.
Let's see. Joby Cates,
She's going to be Zoom, and Kelly just entered via Zoom.
all right. Thank you. Yakov Delaney,
He's going to be Zoom too.
and Cheryl Ingram.
Here.
And I got an email from Judge Sawyer saying that he was not going to be able to join us. So let me, 1, 2. We have quorum, so we can, oops, there's Joby. So we can move into the all-important approval of minutes. You all received minutes from our last meeting for review, and I will ask now if anybody has any corrections, changes, additions, issues.
Pardon me, do I need to be added to the roll? It's
No,
Representative
I
Cassidy.
added you.
Great, thank you.
And I'm seeing Scott Main join, so we will add Scott as well. All right, hearing no issues with our minutes, may I have a motion to approve the minutes as submitted? Was that Judge Salone? And may I have a second? I think I heard a second, but I'm not sure who gave it.
Lisa Daniels.
All right. Okay, then for those in the room, all who are in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Do we have no nays? Do we have any abstentions? All right. Then for those who are on video, I need to do the roll for you guys. So here we go. Kelly Cassidy,
Aye, sorry, was having muting problems.
okay. Colin,
Aye.
Bob Berlin,
That's here in person.
Yeah, I'm here.
are you, what, your vote on the minutes approval?
He's in the room, Kathy.
Oh, that's right, sorry. Ari Jones,
Aye.
Scott Main,
Aye.
Joby Cates,
Aye.
Shoba,
Aye.
and I think that covers it. So our minutes are approved. Before we get started with the meat of our agenda, I just want to thank Bill Nissen and the Union League Club for hosting us with our move out of 300 West Adams, and the fact that the room we were in last time is the only big meeting room in the new 555 building. It was not easy finding a room. So out of the generosity of the Public Affairs Committee at the Union League Club, Bill was able to secure this location, and we're also grateful that they have an actual interest in this topic. So many thanks, Bill, and we can now move on, Susan, to previewing the agenda and getting on with the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Most of our time today is going to be spent learning about, hearing the latest knowledge and practice about behavioral health and resentencing. Rob Jeffries and Latoya Hughes are going to, from the Department of Corrections, they're going to provide us with an overview of the data to help us frame this discussion this morning. And then we have a panel of experts who are going to share the knowledge gains of recent years and speak a little bit about how that might influence or affect the thinking around resentencing. Each of the panelists will talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a significant amount of time for questions and answers and discussion. The judge, Judge Mark Salom, will then walk us through the principles that will be guiding our work going forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our gratefully, I'm screwing up here. I'm going to turn it over to Rob Jeffries, who's from the Department of Corrections.
Good morning, all, and thank you for having us. I'm just going to be like the person who's trying to go and do cleanup, because I know we have Chief Hughes in the audience who's going to go through the presentation as it relates to what our snapshot of our population is. And then I'm going to follow up at the end with some things that we have talked about internally about some of the opportunities that we could present to help facilitate this tremendous effort you guys are put forth with, you have before you to try to come up with some criteria and processes for this endeavor. So, Chief Hughes, if you can take it from here and go over the snapshot of what our data is. I don't know if we have a PowerPoint presentation, but
We do.
all right, awesome.
We'll be sharing that momentarily. If those of you on the screen can let me know when you see it.
It's there. I'm doing both.
All right, wonderful. All right, so we're going to share an overview of behavioral health and substance abuse disorders at the Illinois Department of Corrections as it relates to our population. So first off, we're going to cover the total mental health caseload, the caseload that's designated as seriously mentally ill, and then we have some data as it relates to gender-specific designations between the mental health caseload and the seriously mentally ill caseload, an overview of substance abuse disorders and a treatment program and capacity at the Illinois Department of Corrections. And then lastly, an overview of the assessment tools utilized within the Illinois Department of Corrections for various programming purposes. As it relates to behavioral health, as of May 2022, the Illinois Department of Corrections roughly had a population of 29,000 individuals in custody. Of that 29,000 individuals in custody, a little over 43% were receiving some type of mental health services within the Illinois Department of Corrections. Of that 29,000 individuals in custody, a little over 13% were designated as SMI or seriously mentally ill. And so within the Illinois Department of Corrections, that SMI designation is generally for someone who, as a result of a mental disorder, exhibits impaired emotional, cognitive, or behavioral functioning, and that interferes with their ability to function adequately without supportive services or treatment. All right, so as it relates to behavioral health, our male population versus our female population, as you can see, the overall incident rate for mental health related to males in the Illinois Department of Corrections is almost 42%. Of the female population within the Illinois Department of Corrections, almost 73% has a mental health or is on a mental health caseload. As it relates to the seriously mentally ill population or designation, As it relates to females within the Illinois Department of Corrections population, a little over 31%. And as it relates to the male population, over 12%, almost 13%, are designated as seriously mentally ill. Data related to our program for substance abuse disorder and treatment. So these are our facilities that have substance abuse programs. For those of you who are not familiar, Crossroads ATC is our facility within the community, where individuals in custody go after they leave a more secure facility. So that's the one that's in the community up here, actually in the Chicagoland area. As it relates to Decatur and Logan, those are our women's facilities. And then the other facilities are our facilities that hold the male population within the Illinois Department of Corrections. So there are 9 facilities that have substance abuse programs within the Illinois Department of Corrections. As of June 2022, of our roughly 29,000 population of individuals in custody, 12,457 were diagnosed with substance use disorders. Our total bed for substance abuse treatment, 2,550. And as of June, so I would say maybe a couple of days ago, there were 0 beds available. So that entire 2,550, there is someone in that bed or in that position receiving substance abuse services. Yes, Chief Davis.
You had 9 facilities that have substance abuse capacity. How many facilities total are there in the state?
Director Jeffrey, 31?
27. And I'm going to touch on that in a little bit further once we get to the
All right, and then we were asked to provide some of the information as it relates to assessment tools utilized at the Illinois Department of Corrections. So there are a number of assessment tools utilized, one being the Ohio Risk Assessment, and that assesses risk and needs used for individuals in custody and their likelihood to reoffend. It is utilized at all Illinois Department of Corrections facilities. There's a parole risk assessment tool that is utilized to assess the likelihood for individuals to return to a facility, and it's utilized for all people on mandatory supervised release. Security classification tools, it's utilized to establish custody levels within the various facilities at the Illinois Department of Corrections. There is the what's called the TABE test, the test of adult basic education. And so it is utilized to establish basic educational needs and place people in specific educational programs within the Illinois Department of Corrections. The TCU score, it's utilized to determine substance abuse treatment and intervention needs. And then the mental health and medical assessments, there's a variety of mental health and medical diagnostic screening tools that staff utilizes to determine somebody's need and designation within the classification of SMI or seriously mentally ill, or whether or not they need some inpatient treatment or outpatient treatment. And so that is a snapshot of our numbers as it relates to the population and the designations of mental health needs and seriously mentally ill, a snapshot of substance abuse population, and the capacity within the facilities currently to provide that programming, and a little information about some of the various assessment tools that are utilized currently within the Illinois Department of Corrections. And I know Director Jeffrey wants to provide some more information and some more meat as you consider that data. Director Jeffrey?
Thank you, Chief. So I'll start with the last question that was posed about how many facilities we have in totality, and I mentioned 27, and that's not adequate, and so that just speaks to when we start considering the criteria for individuals to be considered, we have to look at the resources that is currently available as well too. But I'll have a solution for that here shortly. But some of the factors that we want to just bring to this task force is some of the rehabilitation efforts that we have in place for consideration as we start looking at individuals for resentencing. The programming, the job readiness should be factors, and the risk to recidivate. And based on a risk and needs assessment, we have to tailor each program to address that particular individual based on case planning. Some of the opportunities that we need to take in consideration is geographically. I mean, the geography of Illinois, and it speaks to the substance abuse being offered, is just not conducive for people south of Illinois to receive a lot of programming. I don't know how to address that other than funding and more collaboration with other state agencies, i.e. the Division of Alcohol and Substance Abuse, IDH, to be able to augment some of them services in those communities where community providers are in the southern part of Illinois. If we want to consider programming as a criteria specifically addressed to substance abuse in consideration. Along with programming, funding is space. Those who have been familiar with, we have a lot of rich programming at Stateville and Danville. That's not so when we start getting further down the state. So you take those factors in consideration, along with the type of population that is in these other facilities, security levels. The access to programming is not conducive for everybody. Some of the things that we've looked at as we try to incentivize our population to award earned discretionary credit is we redid our whole classification, which was one of the tools to start reducing people from higher security down to lower security so they can have more access to programming and be able to transfer to other facilities that have more programming. That's an incentive that we are applying with our earned discretionary credit. And we also, we can talk a little bit about our reentry pathways. Will that be mandatory for individuals who we considering for resentencing? Will it be mandatory for them to go through a pathway for job readiness, housing, and making sure all the tangibles are in place, Medicaid and all that stuff prior to their release? And then the other piece, I know I read, that's there's a lot of work I see you guys have got before you. I read a lot of literature on the information that you guys have done up to this far. And then the question I have is on the end part of that release, how will we be looking at MSR? We have a risk assessment for MSR right now, but there should be some other people at the table as well too, because we're only one entity of the two-prong approach for MSR application and recommendation for release. And I'll leave that right there. And then the other thing is, what does our data tell us? I don't know what population we're looking at. I probably have to have Dr. Olson and my team put the numbers together so I can identify in what facilities they are and what programs available for them and what security level they are, so we can get those folks in a good preparation for release. And the last point I want to make is preparing the community. We have current concerns right now with certain population trying to be released. Sex offenders, we have problem with getting violent offenders out. We have problem with getting folks with seriously mental illness wraparound services for where they get out and they have a landing spot. The laws and the biases about sex offenders and violent offenders. And we just need to make sure that we have the resource or landing spots for folks who are being considered, because right now I have about 1,700 people who are stuck during their MSR time because I don't have wraparound service landing spots for them once they get out to the community. So that's preparing the community and getting our community partners involved. in advance of moving forward with this this task force mission. So, and then I looked at a couple of other states, how they've done the research about researching the old law and the new law, or in truth in sentencing, indefinite sentencing, and just doing a snapshot of average of time served based on, you know, the indefinite laws, particular crimes, and that's a lot of work if you go that route. But and then, you know, do we want to go a little further and start looking at some changes to mandatory minimums? I know how the First Step Act with the feds are doing, and we're looking at the drug crimes and what have you, because of disparity of how that's been racially. People have been put in prison based on crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. So those are a lot of factors. I know you guys have probably been chewing that up enough, so I didn't want to add more to it. But I do want to say that we are committed to whatever part we can play in it. I mean, we've shown that we have changed a lot of our methodologies and how we're managing our population to award more credit to get more people out. But I always just want to leave y'all with this. If you're going to give extra, you know, expectations on either individual or agency and everything, that has to come with resource. We find that all the time, that we just keep putting stuff on people's plates and expecting them to do the same outcome with the same amount of resources. It just doesn't happen. I just want to be prepared for that in advance. So that's all I have. Questions?
God, I think I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I had a couple questions, and the first was, and it was, you know, partially for me, but also maybe partially for the room as well. Director Jeffries, when you mentioned that, you know, there are two bodies at work evaluating MSR determinations, that you are simply one of those two. I was wondering if you could explain what you mean by that in terms of the second actor at play when it comes to MSR. And then the other question I had was tied to the risk assessment tools that are currently in operation. And that was sort of just curious to help us sort of understand the work that goes into those tools, sort of how much is based on self-reporting, you know, through the Ohio assessment and security classification type things like that, and how much is static, like how much is time and crime, like that goes into making the sort of rankings or however you sort of are sorting these things out. How much is based on sort of individualized based assessment, and how much is immovable based on static information?
And who am I talking with?
Sorry, Scott Main. I'm a attorney with the State Appellate Defender's Office.
All right, so my reference to the MSR is the PRB is the other entity that has a say in, you know, electronic monitor, and when we try to provide somebody back, refer somebody back for early release off of electronic monitor or off MSR. So based on our risk assessment that's been implemented into the parole division, one of the things I've seen in the principle was about time and crime. Sometimes folks they want to hold that scarlet letter over people once they're done their 20 years. I mean, we shouldn't be supervising somebody in the community based on the crime they committed 20 years ago. It should be based on their programming, their risk to recidivate, what needs have been addressed, and what have you. So that's how we're addressing our MSR and referred back to get people early release. We just want to incentivize that, the end part of our incentivized population management. Does that answer the question?
That helps.
Okay. And then as far as the risk assessment, it's, you know, if you're familiar with the Ohio risk assessment about the 5 domains, criminal history, social behavior, employment, family and social support, substance abuse, mental health, and criminal style. I think those are pretty static. And we have a risk and needs assessment policy that I can provide to everybody as well too, that gives people direction on how to complete it, and then explains it in totality of the process for the reentry for the risk assessment as well too. And it also has a supplementary tool in here as well too. So I can provide that for the group.
Thank you, Director.
Joby, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. Hello, Director Jeffries. It's nice to see you again. It's Joby Cates from Restore Justice. I had a question, and I think I do want to honor and recognize the work that the department has done in the past, year and a half, 2 years in ramping up mechanisms for early release. And I think if I've read it right, I think you all have learned so much as a leadership team at IDOC, and have been pretty consistently improving your processes and how you've been managing early release due to the pandemic. The relationship of that growth to what we're talking about here, I think, can be pretty direct, because you didn't have a chance to plan and to do mandatory pathways and to make sure everybody got a certain set of resources before they left. You just didn't have the time to do that. As an agency, you had a different mandate. And I believe we don't have data yet to sort of review. I think it'll be probably another year or two before that data could be emerge and be analyzed. But what I've observed is not a whole lot of increased sort of mayhem or problems by and large due to those early releases. That those early releases, for the most part, with some exceptions, people returned to community. They were either went to a parole placement of their choice, or they were placed somewhere you had identified, and have been living their lives. And an either consistent or, quite frankly, maybe even lower number of people have come back into the system. And I think where this is going is actually a question. I apologize for speechifying a little bit, but you said in the beginning, when you were looking at the mental illness numbers and the lack of programming, particularly for people with serious mental illness or mental illness, when you talked about considering it as a factor in early release, I think I heard you say, I'm not sure what I heard you say, so I want to get some clarity. Is lack of programming in your mind a hindrance to early release because it should be required for early release? Or is it a rationale for early release because having fewer people in this limited number of beds for people with mental illness, having fewer people in the system overall would free up resources to support those who remain? So is it mitigation or aggravation, Director Jeffries, this lack of programming?
Pose the question like a true lawyer, Joby.
I'm so not a lawyer, which is hilarious, but I'm not a lawyer, but I hang around with them a lot. So there you go.
So that was about a 3-part question, and I'll address every 3 parts. Yes, so we did find success. You make diamonds out of pressure. And so we were able to take what we did with pandemic and turn it into a management style, and we incentivize it. So we even work with some advocate community and some legislators, and we expanded the use of earned discretionary credit to make that available for all those. And, not just those who are low risk, but also to those who are moderate and high. So you put that sense of hope out there. I mean, that's the best way I can describe it. And so that it incentivizes everybody to want to achieve that. And based on those releases, I think the last calculation was about 4,000 based on earned discretionary credit. And I have this number right here because I always get posed this question by somebody at some appropriation hearing about, well, what about all the crime increase that, as a result of all those folks you let out? Well, out of the 4,000, only 159 people have come back. I'll take those numbers any day. So, And we've also taken this opportunity to change some law to utilize our adult transition centers better as well too. We're starting to put folks who had long sentences and violent offenses in our ATCs because those are the ones who need it the most. You know, those are the ones who've been doing Buck Rogers time. Then they get out. They need a landing spot to help them transition into the community. Now, I try to use that same methodology to put the sex offenders in there. Boy, and you would have thought, what's the saying? You would have thought I shot the Pope. Everybody, you know, so I'm just saying, these are the type of things, the roadblocks are going to come before us when we start letting people out. And we just conversation we need to have, and we need to prepare the community for those type of individuals being released, because you'll get pushback. And like I said, I got 1,700 people that I can't release because of laws. Now, to your last question about the mental health, seriously mentally ill population, I would say both to your answer. One is we need to have the resources, we need to have the programming to address their needs, right? Because if we don't address their needs, then when they get out, they'll do it again. Or on the flip side of that, to let them out, we need to have a place for them to land. We need community service, wraparound services, so they can address those needs in the community. So we can have it both ways, but the key to all this is funding and resources. Now, I'm not asking for no money. I'm just saying what we need to be able to do is put the money in the right hands so we can have those resources either in the community, or we provide some other agency to provide me that resource if I can't do it myself. I don't want to do mental health. To be quite honest, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do medical or mental health. I got 2 agencies in the state of Illinois who can do medical and mental health way better than what I can. I just think we need more collaboration with that.
I appreciate you, Director Jeffries, and I appreciate what you've done. And I agree, prison isn't the right place to provide adequate mental health services for anyone, let alone people with the most severe mental illness. And I really, I want to just highlight what data you shared about returns. I agree that you did it. It's just an impressive thing that with very little, as you said, pressure makes diamonds. With very little preparation, we've managed to do something. And then finally, on something pretty wonderful and something that is a proof point we should be acknowledging. And then finally, I do want to say that the work that you did with community organizations, that the department really showed that you could reach out to community organizations and work in constructive partner around the COVID vaccine. And I think if we took that same approach as a community to releasing people who have, you know, what we would say some of the scarier offense titles, we know, you and I both know, Director Jeffries, that not all of them are dangerous, scary people. Sometimes what's in the words on someone's piece of paper on their record doesn't reflect who they truly are or their true threat. If we work together, we can address those really difficult challenges of placing people back in community when the community has concerns about the words on the piece of paper. I think we can do it, and I appreciate you. Thank you.
I appreciate you as well too, but I will not take the credit for this. I have an awesome team over here. You know, pretty much everybody over here. They have been working hard, and they don't stop. I mean, they are committed. So I can't say enough about the team here at IDOC.
Well, I think we need to move on to our panel, but thank you so much, Director Jeffries. And I will say that I think you do deserve some credit here because you created the environment in which that team can do its best work. So I am going to, I guess, start off a little bit. Actually, no, I'm going to hand it back over to Susan, who will introduce our panel, and then we'll set the table before we get started. Susan, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Director Jeffries, and Chief Hughes for providing the frame for a discussion this morning. We have three wonderful panelists available to us to talk about the next level of this discussion. We have a forensic psychiatrist with us. Dr. Joanna is on the screen, I believe.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, I am.
And then, thank you. And then we're going to be joined by Danielle Sarid, who is a restorative justice leader. And then, we have here in the room, Jacques Chevelle. Pronounce your last name for me.
Oh, Charlier.
Charlier,
Yeah.
who is a diversion expert, and certainly expert in all aspects of criminal justice. They are going to provide each of them is going to speak for about 15 minutes and provide some additional background for us. Their bios are in the packet of materials, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time singing their praises. They all deserve kudos for their backgrounds and for taking the time with us this morning. Kathy, were you going to say a sentence or two about the panel that we anticipate?
Yes, I want to remind our members that we are focused on how we can incorporate the knowledge that we learned today about current standards and current understanding into looking forward in a resentencing modality. This is new, we all know that. And I think it's important for us not to get mired down in trying to understand an individual's case. And for purposes of this discussion, we need to assume that the court or the individual, I'm sorry, somebody needs to mute. Okay, we need to assume that we will not have access to any evidence that may have been presented in the original sentencing hearing about impact of trauma, mental health, or substance use disorder. We're looking at a population, some of them have been in so long, the records probably don't exist anymore. And the other thing is in many, many sentencing hearings, it's, most plea bargains, we don't get a lot of evidence presented in mitigation. So that's the assumption for today. And we're going to work hard to keep the focus on looking forward. And I think we're very lucky to have a forensic psychiatrist. I think we're very lucky to have a woman in Danielle who started a program that was groundbreaking and many years ago came to Chicago to talk about implementing it here. We did not. And to have Jack, who has been in the policy arena on substance use disorders for a very long time. So I will hand it over to my very good friend, Heather O'Donnell, to get the panel started.
Thanks, Kathy, and good morning, everybody. As you heard from Director Jeffries, Illinois and every state really has struggled with effectively addressing and investing in behavioral health in every setting, both in prison and in the community. And everybody knows that treatment capacity is limited, as we just heard, particularly in prison. We also just want to say that we had a very significant investment this year in Medicaid rates for community-based mental health, about $200 million, that was supported by the General Assembly and the Governor's Office. This truly was historic. The unfortunate thing is that it's just the start, quite frankly, of really rebuilding the community mental health system. We have a long way to go, but we have a lot of focus on it. We also know that incarceration can exacerbate mental health issues and also cause serious trauma on its own. It's important to remember in these discussions that people do change over time. They are resilient and adaptive. And given all of this, Kathy and others here have pulled together a panel of experts to talk to this task force about the knowledge we have of behavioral health and trauma and what role it should play in the consideration of resentencing of an individual that has served an extensive period of time. So with that, I think we will have Danielle Tered from Common Justice kick us off. I believe she is on virtually. She is. Okay.
Yes. Hello. Great. Well, thank you all so much for your time and for your really good work. I am Chicago born and raised, and so you are especially close to my heart in what you're doing. And I come to you today, as somebody who came of age in Chicago. I come to you first and foremost, as a survivor of serious violence. And second of that, as a critic of excessive incarceration. Those two things are deeply linked for me, as I believe they should be in our nation and our public policy. And so we'll try and talk about some of that today, but all of the deepest lessons I know about this, my education about it, formal education came later, but my deepest lessons all came from your state. So I want to start by saying, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that for the kinds of cases you're considering resentencing, as I understand it, most of those will be cases in which the defendants, now the people who have been convicted, have caused very serious harm. And I think it's important that we not pretend that's not the case or ignore it. And certainly that we not pretend that we have to somehow be able to put that aside in order to make an affirmative decision to support their release after serving decades, in some cases, incarcerated. And so I believe that becoming a country that can end violence will have to begin with facing the pain violence causes. That there's not a pathway to safety, to healing, to justice that doesn't begin with a deep regard for what's been done and what's been lost. That we can't solve a problem we won't look at squarely, that envisioning responses to violence requires that we contend honestly and unflinchingly with the lasting impacts of harm, that we take seriously those consequences and the people who experience them, that we regard the transformation of the pain violence causes as our collective responsibility, and that we commit to understanding that pain more fully so we can help ease it. Today, I'd love to talk a little bit about what trauma is and does. I apologize to those of you in the room who could give this same talk. I'm sure there are many of you, but I think we often throw words like trauma around, and I think it's important that we're clear about what we mean together when we say it today. And then I'll talk some about what I think this means for the people you are considering resentencing, and then also a bit about how to think about the victims of these original cases in your larger consideration of the choices before you. And so, most of this is very well known to you, that traumatic experiences affect our brains. They affect our entire body chemistry. Like we're used to hearing about fight or flight, freeze and submit also deserve to be on that list. But it's a full body chemical response, and it's one that is built into us so that we survive. And so in a really fundamental way, like our animal brain takes over and says, like, this is not actually a time for philosophical consideration. This is a time to survive. And so, for example, like if you're about to be eaten by a tiger, it wouldn't be productive for you to be like, look, I've been a vegetarian, but does my commitment to not hurting animals apply in this moment that one is barreling toward me? Like you would be dead, you would be gone. And so part of what happened is as humans, we evolved like these extraordinarily smart brains, which are generally an asset to us. But in times of potentially mortal threat, they are a disadvantage because that kind of higher order thinking will get us killed. And so what happens, what we built in evolutionarily, right, is sort of a kill switch, right, to turn off all of that higher order thinking so that we can make decisions in the interest of our survival, which is why we run. It is why we fight. It is why we freeze. It is why like all the blood goes from our core organs, including our brains, to our limbs, right? So that we can fight, so that we can run, so that we can move. And overall, it is an asset to us that we can do that. The problem with trauma is when that physiological response persists after a period of imminent threat, right? And so it means like, it's like we slam on the gas pedal and that gas pedal gets stuck down. And so you imagine driving a car with the gas pedal like pinned to the floor where you can't release it. And sort of no matter how well you drive, you are bound at some point to crash that vehicle. That's what trauma looks like. It's when our bodies can't get out of some of the cycles that our initial response to threat develops in us. And some of what that means over time is we experience hypervigilance and hyperarousal, which includes perceiving and responding to greater danger than is actually there. So there will be people in circumstances who act in ways that appear extremely aggressive, where they themselves experience it as essential to their own survival, to their own defense, sometimes incorrectly. It includes re-experiencing, it includes flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, images, sensations. And I think it's really important to talk that a traumatic experience, a flashback is not a memory. It is a feeling that it is happening again. And so when we experience them, we feel all of the sensations we felt in the moment, including all of that physiology that kicks in. It includes avoidance and withdrawal, which includes things like numbness and feeling separate from everyone and everything, pulling away from relationships, relying on substances to eat symptoms or to forget, forgetting what happened, minimizing what happened, normalizing what happened. Those things I'll talk about later. They're all relevant to your consideration. It includes really dysfunctional response to threats. Your overloaded symptom does too much or too little when you feel endangered. An overall reduced sense of safety, a reduced sense of trust in individuals or institutions that you could otherwise rely on for safety. Anger, fear, panic, hopelessness, despair. When those things persist past a few months, they get called post-traumatic stress disorder. And that includes the continuation of all of those effects above, but also starts to accrue to long-term health effects, including disease, disability, shorter lifespan, like long-term effects on things like our endocrine systems, right? Because we are continually transmitting these hormones that are costly for our body to process. All of these things are true for the victims of the crimes that you're considering, right? They're all things that for the surviving victims or for the loved ones of victims who were killed or who were deceased, that they have experienced. But they are also all true for the people you are considering resentencing. I am fundamentally in the work of ending violence, like that's my business area. I'm in the criminal justice reform in the criminal justice space as a guest, as somebody whose fundamental work is about violence. And I have met thousands and thousands of survivors of violence and thousands of people who have committed it. And of all the people I've met who have committed violence, I have never met someone who committed violence who didn't survive it first, not once. I don't believe such people exist. And if they do, they are one, not just in a million, but in hundreds of millions. No one enters violence the first time by committing it. That doesn't mean people don't have responsibility for the harm they commit. They do. We could have a whole separate conversation about restorative justice, about what I think people are actually obligated to when they cause harm. And the brief answer to that is that they're responsible for repairing what they've done to the best degree possible and becoming people who won't do it again. But they are also entitled to something as survivors. And so part of that, like as we think about the effects of trauma, right, all of the things I described can arise from just single events, just one thing that happens that's terrible to you. Most of the people you are considering have experienced chronic trauma. And chronic trauma amplifies these things almost immeasurably. It affects, like childhood trauma, affects basic brain development. It affects the baseline of how we feel safe, of how we can think. It affects fundamentally our capacity for decision making. It can be debilitating to us. And all of those things should affect our understanding of people's culpability. And so when we are thinking about whether somebody can be released, I think there are some main things we think about, right? We think about punishment for its own sake. Even if I think we believe that punishment in its own right has a value, that's not my own view, but I understand it. I don't believe that value outranks others, particularly things like safety and fairness. I think those are more important values to anchor a society than punishment itself, and that when they are in tension, I will choose safety and fairness, especially safety and fairness together over punishment. We think and talk about deterrence, but as I'm sure you all know, there is absolutely no evidence that longer sentences have a greater deterrent effect, none. And so when we do or don't decide to release somebody, especially after a long sentence, is entirely irrelevant to the deterrent discourse, right? To thinking about the prevention of future crimes, including by others. You will be thinking about incapacitation, right? And I'll talk some about some things I think understanding trauma are important in understanding whether somebody is a risk to others. As spoiler alert, the main predictor of that will not be what they did 20 years ago. And that you will have to be able to take a view to their more current behavior. And the other thing I expect you will consider is survivors' healing. And I want to be able to talk openly about this. You'll want to think about the effect of these crimes on their victims and what that means for you in thinking about resentencing. So in the question of that central question first then about whether incapacitation is still necessary, the main consideration for this is not the original crime, which cannot and will not change. If the original crime is the basis for your consideration of this, you should not bother with a whole fancy process, because I assure you the past will not become different over time. And so what you want to think about instead is, what are your indicators that that behavior won't continue? I think it's really important to not over rely on any individual's affect, including in parole hearings and comparable spaces. One of the effects, the lasting effects of trauma, is that people will develop very flat affect, especially if there are times that they feel fearful, if they are in the presence of someone with much greater power than them, if they are talking about something that is difficult or triggering. So you will find people who seem really flat, and therefore it seems like they are unemotional, they are not empathetic. You worry that that is pathology and you want to keep them in. Those kinds of communication styles are not an indicator that somebody is unsafe. And it is really critical that they're not read as such. Like affect is not a proxy for safety. And that matters a great deal in all the ways you consider people. That is true generally in the context of power, but particularly and specifically true for survivors of trauma. You want them to look at their behavior with an understanding of the constraints on their behavior that are inherent in a prison environment. So you want to ask, are there current indicators that this person is harmful? Frankly, if someone isn't committing violence regularly in prison, they are not committing violence. Prison is the hardest place on earth to not commit violence, the hardest. People I know who've gone in to do time for nonviolent crimes who could not lay a finger on another person learned to be violent inside in order to survive. So someone who is capable of not committing harm inside is entirely capable of not committing harm when free. Those environments are productive of violence. They require violence to survive. People are threatened on a daily basis all the time. There is a culture around masculinity, around violence, around all of this where people establish their place in a hierarchy through acts of violence. And if they aren't sufficiently high in that hierarchy, they will be punished for it with pain on pain on pain. And so the skill set actually to not be violent in prison far exceeds the necessary skill set to not be violent when one is free. And so that means if you see somebody who is not consistently committing violence in prison, you have a good bet they will not do it when they are free. Even some violence in prison is predictable as part of the environment. So I also mean, like, if someone had one incident however long ago, that doesn't mean they go in the no pile, right? That you understand that anyone who can minimize their involvement in violence in that context has developed a skill set to not cause harm that is transferable to the free world. And frankly, that exceeds the skill set that will be needed if they are free. The other thing that is true with all I've said about trauma is that people do heal. People find ways to come through the pain they experience. They find ways to quiet some of the symptoms. They find ways to regulate their bodies, to regulate their minds. Now, prisons are not designed for healing. They are generally antithetical for that. But even in that context, people heal even there. And so one thing I would encourage people to look at is to look for signs of an appetite for healing, of attempts to heal that underlying pain. People won't get all the way there in prison because the environment is so inherently harmful. But things like program participation, engagement with family or loved ones who still engage them, self-reflection, but also their behavior. Like, what are they doing day in and day out, and what do you know about that? And then also it's important, I think, to understand incarceration as not just inherently violent, but inherently re-traumatizing. And to understand that everyone we have in prison is a survivor of violence. Like they are the subset of survivors who went on to pass that pain on to others, but they are all survivors, right? Which means the pains we inflict on people who are incarcerated are pains we are inflicting on people who survived harm, who our social institutions did not give access to healing. And so in my view, that means there has to be an affirmative justification to continue inflicting that pain on somebody, not an affirmative justification to release them. And so you have to seek an indication of why, of the affirmative justification to keep somebody in. And absent current indicators that they are actively engaged in causing harm, I don't believe such a justification exists. And so the last thing I'll talk about is how to think about the survivors of these crimes. And so you will necessarily be thinking about the harm people caused. Most people serving sentences of that length did terrible things to other people, things that none of us have a right to do. One of the things that has driven me most deeply to restorative justice is an understanding from my own lived experience, from the experience of others around me, of the basic fact that the incarceration of people who commit harm does not heal survivors. And I don't mean that as a moral position, and I don't mean it as a political or philosophical position. I mean it as a very pragmatic physiological observation, that the way we are built as people, somebody else's pain doesn't reduce ours. There's a reason if you go to the doctor with back pain, they can't just bring somebody in and twist their backs around and suddenly yours is resolved. Like, it doesn't work. There's a reason that if we have been the victims of violence, that punching somebody else in the street doesn't mean we will not have nightmares that night. We are not built in such a way that another person's suffering relieves ours. And so what that means is that...
Excuse me, iPhone 12, can you please mute yourself?
Great.
You've given me co-host, so I did it.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
And one of the things when I wrote a book called Until We Reckon, and one of the things I did when in writing the book was did a FOIA request and read a bunch of the letters that survivors have written to parole boards, including letters that oppose the release of the people who hurt them or murdered their loved ones. And the through line in those letters is that most of them say they feel the same way they did, like on the day it happened. And I think, on the one hand, we think, okay, that's a justification to keep the person in. But on the other hand, there's a different way to understand those, which is that no matter how long somebody is in, that 10 years, 15 years, 20 years of this thing that we're doing in the name of survivor has made zero contribution whatsoever to their healing. There is no evidence anywhere whatsoever that the duration of a defendant's healing accrues to benefit to victims, none. So there are surveys that say victims prefer longer sentences. They particularly prefer them before those sentences are imposed. There is no evidence whatsoever drawing a causal link between a person's sentence and that survivor's healing. And that relates to that physiological truth I shared, which is that those things are actually disconnected. And so when I look at those parole letters, part of what I see is that as a society, the only thing we have offered to survivors is the punishment of the people who hurt them. It's like if somebody burned down my house and the one thing you could do for me is burn down their house in my name. However much that might please me momentarily, what I need is somewhere to live. And there is no amount of ravaging that other person's home that is going to bring me shelter. And so I think it's really critical we understand that to the degree we are invested in victims' healing, our investments should be elsewhere. They should be in ensuring all victims have access to healing supports, ensuring all victims have access to therapeutic supports, to victims' compensation, to therapy that works for them from someone who looks like them, who can talk to them in a way that helps them move through, that they can be in groups with other people who've experienced comparable harm. Everybody who has experienced a loss deserves those things. And they deserve those things because unlike incarceration, those things will deliver them, at least partially, from their pain. And so I will stop there because I'm very excited to hear the other panelists and with just huge appreciation for all of your time.
Thank you, Danielle. Why don't we go now to Jack?
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Heather. Good morning, everybody. Hope you're doing well. My name is Jack Charlier, and I am with Task Center for Health and Justice. Got a very quick opening, and then I'll get into really the question that Kathy asked today, which is, what do we know about drugs and crime today that we did not know 20 to 30 years ago? And the good news is we actually know quite a bit more in just 2 to 3 decades than we used to know. But just to set the context for me, because I know a few of you and Kathy and others, you know Task and the Center for Health and Justice. My professional work, however, is community-based crime reduction focused on reducing drugs, reducing drug-related crime, and how that drives crime. So you hear the drug-crime connection in the communities. The mantra for anybody in my field of crime reduction is allow no new victims. And we actually use the word victims, but the field of victims uses the word survivors, but I use it there. Allow no new victims, do no future harm, and repair what got us here. So you hear all 3 of those things in play. So as you hear what I say today, I want you to know that those are all mixing into this. Within the past, most of my work has focused on parole, working in the arena of parole. I do a lot of work with the courts in the space of crime reduction, but more recently, and Chief Davis is here, and I already told him I'm going to pull him aside before we leave. My work is in the field of deflection, which is a very rapid growing movement in the United States where law enforcement and drug treatment are working together in a community setting, again, around crime reduction, around reducing drug use and drug-related crime. A couple more comments and I'll get into it. The first thing to know about substance use, people who use drugs, is that unlike mental health, which is not criminogenic, right? Mental health is not linked to crime. I know the media has that big narrative, but it's generally not linked to crime. Drug use is causally related to crime. There's correlations between mental health and drug use and crime, but only causal connections exist with drug use, with one small exception. Beyond criminal offending behavior, there are other uses that we now understand much more about related to drug use, and that is children, which we ignore pretty much and have ignored. In other words, the children in the home, the families, and then the damage that exists to the communities in which drug activity and people who use drugs can impact well beyond their household. And so in our work, we talk about victims, survivors, we talk about children, we talk about families, and we talk about the community all around those things that I said: no new victims, do no future harm, and repair what got us here. So let me just give you an opening context of where I am in terms of this. I'm a crime reduction guy. I work at this intersection, yet it's a very complex thing that takes in children, families, victims, community all together. Okay, so what are some of the things that we know and what are that are new, and what are some of the things that have actually been around for a while? So thanks to the leadership, and many of you might know this, Dr. Nora Volkow, who heads up the National Institute on Drug Abuse. She really was one of the leaders, not standalone, who brought in what's called neuroimaging, which is the ability to see the brain while we're still alive, which is a good thing, and understand the effects of drugs on the brain. If you're all familiar with this, feel free to raise your hand and I will move on. If not, it is one of the pioneering elements that has changed our understanding of addiction, right? It has changed our understanding to see things like images of drugs and drug paraphernalia shown to people who use drugs, and their brain lights up as if the drug were right there. We did not know that before 20 to 30 years ago. We knew it instinctively, but we did not know it, and so that has impact. So what does that mean? Again, getting into the space of 20 to 30 years ago when this sentencing happened, right? What is it that judges, prosecutors, public defenders, advocates could have brought to the table that now that they couldn't have brought to the table, but now might have? And that could go any way, right? I'm not taking any kind of side on which way this kind of information would help. So first of all, addiction is a chronic relapsing disease of the brain. It is a disease. Once someone has addiction, it is a disease like hypertension, for example, or diabetes. Again, not relieving the person of the responsibility of what they have done while that is in place, but it is a disease. It is classified now by the American Medical Association, the AMA, as a medical disease. That's important to understand. We're talking about clinical addiction, though. I want to be clear. Again, I'm not taking sides. Someone who just casually uses drugs, does not have addiction, that's not a disease. I want to be very clear on that. The disease is when it is clinically diagnosed There's addiction, and that is disease. We used to think of it 20 to 30 years ago, and certainly when I worked in law enforcement, we thought of it in some shape or form as some kind of moral failing, inability, just say no, all the stuff that we now know does not work for someone who's addicted. And that takes me to the second point that we did not fully understand 20 to 30 years ago. What I mean by we, by the way, I should say, those of us in the criminal justice field, the clinicians had understanding of it to a degree, but in the criminal justice field, which is where I work with police, judges, and parole, it was not well known 20 to 30 years ago. And that is, there is this thing called addiction, which is different than drug use, right? And so you behaviorally, you could have seen it, but when you're dealing with people who have addiction, the world looks different in how they have to be treated and how they view things. They will lie to you, they will cheat, they will steal, they'll do everything they can do because their brain is telling them for their survival, kind of a little bit of what Danielle was saying, right? For their survival, they have to do things. They are differentiated, however, from people who are not addicted, for whom they have probably the ability to kind of control what they do. We didn't fully grasp that in the criminal justice system. By the way, if you know the date 20 to 30 years ago, drug courts started about 25 years ago, one of the preeminent forms of kind of drug interdiction within the justice system. That times to about this, if you notice, right? There's no surprise to that. And drug courts brought in lots of good information and knowledge that have helped us throughout the rest of the criminal justice system. So it's chronic relapsing disease of the brain. There is a difference between addiction and people who use drugs, and don't mix the two up because they are definitely not the same. Recovery from addiction is possible. Our understanding and knowledge of this has grown quite a bit. 20 to 30 years ago, we knew people could recover. We just kind of didn't understand the circumstances of it. But a case looked at nowadays in that space, you could look at pathways to recovery, as we call them, and how that works, and we know a lot more about that. We also know, and in relation to that, that addiction actually physically rewires the brain. It actually changes the brain. We did not know that. And so when I say this, I know there's several judges in the room. Judges, like parole officers, like police, would yell at people, wave the finger, hang things over their head. It didn't matter. And you saw that time and time again, because the brain was actually getting rewired. The other thing we learned is that the brain can be unwired. It can be dewired. We kind of had an understanding of it, but we didn't know how to do it 20 to 30 years ago. And so this idea that the brain gets rewired due to addiction physically, again, addiction versus just simple drug use, it can now be unwired through evidence-based practices like contingency management and cognitive behavioral therapies, which really just rewire it. That's all they do. Contingency management, for example, offers you money, good amounts of money to change your behavior. So sex changes our behavior naturally, food changes our behavior naturally, that survival stuff that I think Danielle was talking about. Money does too. In large enough quantities will rewire our brain, right? So it's kind of interesting, but we didn't fully understand that. We didn't realize kind of the power of things like the ability that we have to rewire the brain. We also used to take a broad brush approach in criminal justice. We didn't understand the individualistic nature of addiction, and that has changed over 20 to 30 years. Now, if you're working in a court, a deflection initiative with police, you're working in an RSTAT program, which is the drug abuse in jail prisons, you'd have individualized plans. 20 to 30 years ago, they were, for the most part, I can tell you, they were very broad brush, very general. We now know that you have to, like any clinical or medical situation, deal with someone individually. We also know, as I said in my opening, what we care about in my field of crime reduction is also the children and families. We understand much better now the intergenerational nature of addiction. We did not know that before. We understood that we could see it and observe it, but we didn't understand why it worked. Through both genetics, there's a genetic loading to mental health as there is for addiction. And so children who are in the presence of people who are using drugs it's a very quick, very too broad brush, but people live in homes as children of people who are using drugs. It becomes normalized. And there can then ultimately be a genetic link to that. The point is, that is new for us. So judges making decisions 20 to 30 years ago might not have grasped that, and certainly we didn't have the ability to fully understand it, but we now understand that much better. We also understand relapse much better, what is called relapse. We tend to kind of now think in the field, and I work both crime and addiction, right? Field is, we now think, for some people this is going to be the case, for others it's not. We're not surprised by it before. Courts parole and probation used to be surprised all the time by relapse. Surprised as in, why does this keep happening? We didn't know that 20 to 30 years ago. Not that it needs to happen, by the way. It's not an excuse, but that it does happen, and we understand that. And so as you look at cases, that is what comes up time and time again. We understand now that medications, this is probably one of the greatest movements within the field of criminal justice as it relates to the intersection of people use drugs. About 10 years ago, a movement began in the United States for what was called medication-assisted treatment, now called medication-assisted recovery. It's pretty much focused on opioids, heroin use, and that is the introduction of modern medications. So methadone, which has been around since the 60s, is a very good medication, very useful for the right person, very inexpensive, by the way, and good to use. However, new medications have been introduced since then, like Suboxone, I use a brand name, Vivitrol, that are very good. They're excellent. We didn't have those 20 to 30 years ago. So the ability to help someone who has an addiction to heroin or opioids actually just did not exist. By the way, the current stimulant wave that's going through the United States around any kind of stimulant, we have no medications. And it's one of the things we're going to have to figure out because everybody's starting to rely on it. Medications, by the way, don't treat addiction. They're not like mental health medications or something you get over the counter. Their only job is to stabilize the person so that the craving stops, so they may get into treatment. They're not like, oh, take this pill and your addiction will go away. It stops the cravings. That's kind of its main purpose. We didn't know that 20 to 30 years ago. We had methadone, a very good medication. I'm going to be very clear on that. Very good, very inexpensive, but it doesn't work at the same level as the modern ones. And Heather, tell me when I've got 2 minutes because I can stop reading at any time. It's totally fine. It's all good. No worry, this is not all things. It's just kind of different comments. Our understanding of ways to, and this might actually be one of the most relevant things here, our understanding of that. Remember I said that an addiction rewires the brain? We actually didn't know that, but we can also rewire it back. It doesn't happen necessarily by not just using drugs. The brain has been rewired already. It is literally hardwired from addiction. We have things like cognitive behavioral therapy, contingency management, which can change the wiring again. We did not know that 20 to 30 years ago. I see Chief Hughes here. I will share a 5-second story or 15-second story. I was one of the very first group of parole officers in the state in the mid-90s that went through the release in the United States of what was called cognitive behavioral therapy back then. And it was a 3-week course, and you had to understand it, and it was about rewiring the brain. And it was pretty cool stuff, but we're like, that has no application whatsoever. Now we know that what we didn't know then is that cognitive behavioral therapy, in fact, does work. It's a very difficult, hard course, but it works. Contingency management works. And they're some of the very best things that change the path for people who have addiction. And they are delivered, by the way, over time. They can be delivered multiple times. They're not limited to kind of one and done type things. Screening and assessment tool, I heard Director Jeffries talk about those. Those have all come in for the most part within the last 20 to 30 years. A little bit of nerd public policy history. The first generation of what are called now risk need assessment tools are from the 70s. They had all static factors, age you did your first crime, age at which you started using. Things that are relevant, by the way, they're not irrelevant. I don't necessarily fully agree with some of the stuff that was said, the research to support it, but the big evolution came in the 90s, and that was what's called Gen 3 tools. And Generation 3 tools of risk need looked at dynamic factors, things that are changeable. What is your family situation? What is your work situation? Not in terms of whether you have a job or not, that's incorrect. It's do I have that bonds and attachment to the community, to work, to pro-social lifestyle, things like that. And so that is another new element that 20 to 30 years ago, what the bench was using, the judiciary was using for its tools were primarily not evidence-based. They were often developed by someone in the courthouse, put together with good intentions, but turned out not to be very good. By the way, all those tools are much better than our brains. They're way better than our brains in making decisions, because our brains can process a little bit of information. Even a tool from the 90s is designed around hundreds of thousands of records that can be processed. Let me see, just a few more points. Again, I'm looking forward more to the discussion. It's very important to understand this issue of drugs being criminogenic. We now know that we did not know back then that different drugs had different criminogenic factor, right? So criminogenic means, in my field, that there is not only a correlation is easy to find, At 7 a.m., the sun's up, so that correlates. But it is causal, right? Mental health is not causal to crime for the most part. Drug use is, and addiction is causal. You can expect crime where there is drug use, and where there's going to be crime, and there's going to be harm. It just is. Not everybody, right? Not everybody. But what we did not know, in addition to our learning in that, is that different drugs have different criminogenic effects. And that's important to understand, right? So we don't just say someone is addicted, therefore everybody who's addicted or has the same impact in the criminogenic sense. They do not. Crack cocaine, for example, is much more criminogenic than marijuana. Heroin is more criminogenic than powder cocaine. We have a much better understanding of that we did not used to. Okay, I'll do 3 more points and then I stop. Again, I'm looking forward to discussion and taking questions and hearing the other speakers. Here's one of the items that is new that we did not know 20 to 30 years ago, transition points, how dangerous transition points are. And for this population in particular that have been institutionalized for a long time, that transition point from the institution and outbound is a very dangerous time, especially if they have any drug use in their past. Do not be concerned with how much, say, what kind of drug use they might have had in prisons, right? We know there's no drugs in prisons, but what kind of drug use they might have had or prior to that. It will come right back with a vengeance within those first few hours. And that's very important to understand. In other words, desistance from drug use to the brain might or might not mean anything at the very first hours, days, and weeks. We did not really fully understand that 20 to 30 years ago. That's important. That's difference now. So someone who used drugs 20 years ago has been abstinent, they might return very quickly. And some of the data, depending, remember I said different drugs had different criminogenic effect. People who use heroin, for example, who have been institutionalized for a while, that might be prison, might be jail, might even be a detox facility in the community for a short amount of time. That heroin is extremely powerful in the brain, and coming out, their risk of overdose, we've known now for not that long actually, is substantially higher for that drug in particular than people who do not use drugs at all or use other drugs, right? We just didn't know that. Okay, let me see if there's, I think, one more here. Yes, very important. This is not, I know the context within which we sit right now in 2022. This is really goes over much longer than that. The idea of resource acquisition, which Director Jeffrey spoke to, equity, gender, language, education, trauma, those things we completely did not understand 20, 30 years ago. I can just tell you that flat out. So whatever decisions the judiciary is making, judges are making, chiefs are making, parole officers, probation are making, we didn't grasp any of that. Gender responsivity only came into the justice world really like late 90s, early starts on it. I mean, really the good hard work of it came in then. Things like language barriers, believe it or not, even education, we just didn't get. And so that means that a lot of the things that have happened to people who've been in for a long term, and again, I just sit on the crime reduction side, probably weren't applied in a way that worked, that might not have worked well or worked at all, might have even caused harm to women, to people who lived in communities that were not well resourced, to people of color. I don't like broad brush of anything, so I use that just to recognize racism and equity. But we didn't understand that 20, 30 years ago. I mean, we understood it like in a sense of like we can see it, but we now know much more about, from a crime reduction standpoint, how to address it and how to deal with it. And Director Jeffries hit on it, by the way, in terms of resources, right? Grand plans, individualistic, well made out, and going back to communities and areas where there's nothing. Last thing I'll say then in closing is to that point of resources, we do crime reduction work globally, not just in the United States. It is, and this is right to that last point, at the end of the day, all the things that are put in place, absent resources, it will not work. You need the resources. It is just, you can take this, like to the bank, as they say, all the things that we know in the United States is the most powerful and rich country in the world, absent resources in a rural community in which we're working, or an inner city community. I hate that word inner city because I'm from Chicago, like it implies something, but a community that's under resourced looks identical to a low income nation that I will work in. The results will be the same. It doesn't matter that we're America. It is the lack of resources that ultimately will not allow a person to move and their family to move beyond where they are. Full stop on that. Thank you, Heather. Yep.
Thanks.
a lot of really good information just
Yeah.
about the science. Our last speaker is Dr. Johanna.
Okay, thank you, Heather. I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see it.
We see
Okay.
it.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm Dan Johanna. I'm the interim chair at the University of Chicago. And I am a forensic psychiatrist by training. And just briefly what that is the overlap between psychiatry and criminal justice system and law, if you will. And on the criminal side, it's issues around evaluating people who are unfit to stand trial, treatment of those people, those who have been found not guilty by reason of insanity, and work in jails and prisons. You've already heard two really great presentations on the chemical dependence issues and on trauma, which is now, trauma is extraordinarily important, and we train all of our residents and therapists now in trauma, as it is a major complication to behavioral health. So I'm going to talk about behavioral health issues primarily, and just some brief background. First, we've been studying mental illness in jails and prisons for a long time, and pretty much consistently in the literature and in studies, 20% of inmates in jails and prisons have serious mental illness. You've heard this term already today. And about 5% are actively psychotic. I know you've heard a definition of serious mental illness, but the way to think about it is it's not just by diagnosis, which is the large circle. So diagnoses like schizophrenia, bipolar illness, severe depression. And you could add in there, I think, substance use disorders are diseases in that group, and even some severe character pathology. So that's the large circle. Then the severity, which includes what you've heard about function, is very important in serious mental illness. And lastly, the duration, and generally that's thought of to last more than a year. So about substance use, upon entry into the system through jails and into prison, about 78 to 80% have co-occurring substance use disorders. The numbers are lower, once you've been convicted. Now, this is a much higher population than we see in the community, where about 4 to 6% of the population has serious mental illness. And one thing that's already been emphasized today is that the resources for even those who are not incarcerated are lacking. So only about 2/3 of those with serious mental illness receive services. And as you know, the inmates are the only group of individuals who have a constitutional right to treatment. It's kind of unusual, but and the treatment doesn't have to be anything really fancy. No ivory tower treatments, just basic mental health care. And although we can talk more about how that's delivered, but that's the basic mental health care, psychiatric and psychological interventions. So I've developed mental health centers. I've run programs. I've worked on inpatient units in the state hospital. Now I run outpatient and inpatient services. I want to make a couple of points to get across. First, what works for serious mental illness is based around case management. You have to have good case managers. There's even some very specific kinds of treatment called assertive community treatment. Heather's very aware of those things. And that is going out into the community. And there's many parts to treating individuals in Illinois and all around the country. It's difficult to find all of this in one place, but I'm going to hone in on a couple of things in the next couple of slides. I do only have a few, so don't panic. And I do want to say that in this question mark, the treatment of trauma and trauma-informed care is now significantly taught in all of our mental health centers and all of our outpatient programs. And there are several kinds of treatment, as Danielle talked about, but it's really to separate this feeling that the trauma is occurring at that moment from the memory. And there's several ways to do that, about exposure treatments and EMDR and several others. And they have to be considered in the treatment. So what do I know? Probably people in this group know more than I do, I think, on some things, but the department, current mental health services in the department, there are now about 28,000 inmates in the Illinois Department of Corrections. And I think, as already has been said about Director Jeffries, the significant reduction of inmates over the last year. But 44% of the current population are on a mental health caseload. They're getting some services. And about 14% have serious mental illness. So you can see this is much higher than the general population. And interesting that although the numbers of detainees have dropped by 23%, the percentage of those who are on the mental health caseload has gone up, and that's from the annual report. So this indicates that those with mental illness actually remain as a higher percentage of the population and are less likely to be released. So the work here that your task force is working on, I think, is so important. And in a study in Pennsylvania of 7,000 people released, men, about 25% received mental health services while incarcerated, and only a small percentage receive mental health services after release. So odds are that if you receive mental health services in prison, you're more likely to serve out your full prison sentence than if you did not. And also in this study, inmates that had multiple mental disorders were more likely to be in more time in solitary confinement than those who did not. This is a bit of an old slide, but I wanted you to get a sense of what the beds are. We are underserved. I think you've heard this from every person so far about underserved, under-resourced. This is an older slide, but I think the pie looks about the same. That the number of people with serious mental illness, most are in the state Department of Corrections, the largest percentage, and then in jails and lockups. The number of forensic beds in the state is about 600. Is now about 726. So you can see even the number of state beds in the last, this is 5 years, data from 5 years ago and data from today, that the current state beds, there's 1,128, 400 are in civil beds, and 726 are forensic beds, 400 are unfit to stand trial and are awaiting trial, and 326 have been found not guilty by reason of insanity. And in the state, already said the population of serious mentally ill is around 3,900. So unfortunately, we've made prison our state hospital for serious mentally ill. In addition, the number of high psychiatric beds in total in Illinois has dropped significantly by at least a third. And so we are under-resourced for beds. although we're doing better in outpatient treatment and funding of outpatient treatment, still Illinois is in the lower half of funding per capita for mental health services. So what do we know about reentry into the community? So in a paper looking at 8 different papers that were those that had the most successful programs demonstrated 3 things, and I think those are the take-home points. Number 1, caseworkers, just like in the community for serious mental illness, who have not been incarcerated, caseworkers are going to be the key. Good social, and a caseworker that has good social skills. It kind of goes without saying, but somebody who cares about this, about the population and understands mental illness. Secondly, on discharge, that they have access to social support and housing. Those are the 2 main points in the studies that were significantly more important than others. And lastly, the caseworker should form the relationship before release, and that same person should follow after release. That's very significant. And when we look at drug use, and I know you've already heard a bit about that illegal drug use in the year after discharge is most associated, it's already been said, with a history of drug problems and with childhood trauma. But legal medication, those who are getting treatment, is associated more with physical health and if you've had a history of mental illness. So the good news here for behavioral health is that those that have been getting treated in prison are more likely to get treated and take medication as an outpatient. Now, I think this has been covered briefly already, but Medicaid coverage at discharge, this has been in studies around the country, assist inmates to become patients. So without coverage when they leave, you already have, as been pointed out, those first days of discharge. So let me conclude. I think I've done it with 2 minutes and 27 seconds left. So more people with serious mental illness are likely to be incarcerated. More are likely to receive mental health services. They're more likely to complete their prison term. They spend more time in solitary confinement. They do better if enrolled in Medicaid before discharge. They have better outcomes if they have decent case managers who meet them before release. And current services are already do not meet the demand. So I would recommend that there be some separate services available for those that are released, that with forensically trained clinicians. I think the current system, and I know the current community mental health system may be very reluctant in this population, to see this population. Now, in the last year, we've developed a restoration unit in our hospital at Ingalls Memorial Hospital. So we're seeing a lot of folks who, may or may not wind up in sentence. It'll depend on the trial. But when I started in the state hospital, this is the exact population we would see. They're severely mentally ill. They don't recognize they're ill, which is part of the disease. And if you can get them treated, either involuntary treated with medications, they can recover. And back in the day when I started, we could keep people a couple months in the state hospital. And now, unfortunately, they come through this doorway, which is, an unfortunate way to get treated. But nonetheless, it gives us that opportunity to see people over time. And lastly, let me say, if there's anything that's come out of COVID, mostly not good, but telehealth is now a permanent, or mental telehealth, not other, but mental telehealth is now a permanent part of our armamentarium. We, oops, I hit the 15-minute mark. It's CMS, federal government, has made it permanent for both Medicaid and Medicare. Probably commercial insurance will also follow suit. And so you don't have to set up programs at every place in the state. You know, I heard Director Jeffrey say about the south end of the state. We can do this from anywhere. If you set up a program somewhere that has these trained clinicians, conceivably you can do the treatment except the case management anywhere. So I think that's one thing that's come out of this. And I personally am doing 75% of my psychiatric work online. So I'll stop there, and I think we're open for questions.
Thank you. I do have some questions that I think could be most beneficial. Really just open it up to task force members for questions of the panelists.
Hey, Heather.
Uh-huh.
Let me interrupt because Shobha has a question for Danielle, and she's going to have to leave in a minute. So if we can allow her to ask her question, and then we'll get to the more general ones.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
I'm so sorry. Hi, I'm so sorry to be doing the ask a question and run. It's super rude. Hi, I'm Shobha Mahadev at the Children Family Justice Center at Northwestern Legal Clinic and a task force member. These presentations were just, wow, so helpful. Thank you so much. Danielle, I sort of have two questions for you, really. One is, I think you mentioned that violence in prison, particularly if it happens kind of early or in a limited way, doesn't necessarily reflect behavior upon release, because prison is a really, challenging environment. That's certainly been my experience working with a lot of people who have gone through that system. What would you say to people who say that if someone's doing well in an incarcerated setting, that's really only because they're in an incarcerated setting? That's certainly pushback we've heard. And then my second question, sorry that these are compound, is with respect to the trauma you were talking about, I think in such a compelling way, that particularly young people and others who commit harm and violence might have faced before they committed that harm and violence. What's your response to the argument that these folks might be, damaged in some way and potentially dangerous upon return, and what can be done to address that? So sorry for those two quick questions.
Yeah. So I thank you for this, and I think they're related. And so I assume everybody here has spent some substantial time in prisons. They are not a place where people are at their best, to put it extremely mildly. Like the notion that what you see in an incarcerated setting is somebody being their best is so unfounded and so out of sync with the reality of what that environment includes. The environment includes not just deprivation of liberty, but the continual presence of threats of violence, the continual exercise, often of brutal power over people, malnourishment, like limited access to people that people love, like all of these things that are drivers of violence. So core drivers of violence on the individual level include shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. The core features of prison are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. We have baked into our response to violence exactly the things that generate it. And so I think the way to understand it is that actually many of us who are peaceful in our daily lives, who are kind in our daily lives, who don't commit violence in our daily lives, were we in prison, we might do it to survive. We might do it because the pain that overcame us was too much. Like we might do it because the entire experience of powerlessness, the violence we experienced, the sexual violence we experienced there, the lack of access to healing supports would break down the thing in us that otherwise prevents us from committing harm. And so actually, like, prisons are a crucible for violence. And so in my view, people who can cease from committing violence in that environment have a skill set to act nonviolently that actually far exceeds the skill set that is required for people who are in general society. I think the question of like what we do when we think about people who are so damaged, as you described, is profound, right? Like, it is true that as a nation, there are children whose pain we have been indifferent to in every possible way, that they have been brutalized on our watch, beaten on our watch, raped, degraded, isolated over and over again by the people who care for them, by the people who are supposed to care for them, and we have failed to protect them. And some of them have been so hurt that those wounds will never be fully healed. That is on us. Like, it is not, the answer to that is not that we then get to inflict greater pain for eternity on them as a result of damage that we allowed to happen on our watch when they were young, like when they were children. And so for me, it's what I mean by saying there has to be a clear, affirmative basis to believe that that person will commit further harm when they're free. And that has to be concrete. It has to be demonstrable. It has to be compelling. It cannot just be, wow, they've been through a lot. And it cannot be, they did this thing 20 years ago. So if you are telling me there is somebody who is persistently committing violence throughout their time in an incarcerated setting, I get it, right? I understand that we may say, though actually I think many people who persistently commit violence in a prison would not necessarily do so free, like because of the nature of that environment. But we don't get to mend our societal failure to protect children by punishing them when they've become adults interminably. The other thing that I think is important to name is that most of the effects of trauma we mostly just hurt ourselves, right? Like, the likeliest thing that will be true is that those children, now adults, will be unable to fully experience joy, that they will never not have nightmares, right? That they will never feel fully at peace. They will never feel fully safe, that they will get in loving relationships and sabotage them because they don't feel safe, even with people who are trustworthy. Like, they are likely to suffer very long-term effects of what happened to them. But most of that suffering will not take the form of externalized violent behavior. And if that's the form it's going to take, you will see that when someone is incarcerated. If someone doesn't have the skill set to not hurt others, if someone is so overcome by the harm we have done to them that they cannot physiologically stop themselves from hurting others, you will see that in a prison, because there is nowhere where it is harder to disengage from violence than there.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and thank you to all of our presenters. That was just really helpful.
Other questions? Sorry, Peter.
Yeah, so when we're talking about drugs and the definition of causal and how drugs are causal, certain drugs cause more crime than others, or impact criminological factors or whatever more. I think at the end of your statement, you sort of touch on it, but it was sort of in passing.
Yeah.
You bring up the systemic thing here. Because the idea is, wouldn't the cause be that would lead someone to the harshness of the narcotics that might be harshness of the behavior? So when you say cause to a behavior, for example, if I had a friend, her brother died from a fentanyl overdose in New Hampshire, massive deindustrialization, they were completely broke and he died in his bed to a fentanyl overdose. One would say that the cause there to that is deindustrialization of the New Hampshire town, and that the treatment for whatever pain he was going through was a whole bunch of other factors. But I just want to kind of expand on that more. I mean, it seems like you're saying a serious, not agree with me. You're saying you're touching on it seems like you're touching on the symptom, but not the quote unquote the disease. Maybe do you get what I'm saying?
I don't fully grasp it, Senator Peters, but so I don't fully grasp what you're asking. So yeah.
I'll do this.
Yeah.
Isn't the cause just the economic and social factor and the severity of that? And then therefore, whether someone entering into quote unquote the justice system writ large or coming out of it, that if we don't actually deal with that could cause the issues at hand when it comes to and drug usage.
So I'd say I have three different parts. First, when I closed my comments, I said that we didn't understand 20 to 30 years ago. We now are using the word equity. We didn't understand equity through that lens. There's validity to what you're saying. I opened up then by saying that part of the work of crime reduction is to repair the breach. That was one of the three principles. Crime reduction through that lens, there's validity to what you're saying. From a purely research standpoint, different drugs have different amounts of rewiring of the brain that occurs, different intensities of that rewiring. I'll use the analogy of food, right? Food and sex, the two main biological drivers of any species, which is good because without them we would not exist or continue to exist. If there's a flavor of ice cream you like better than others, you're going to get a better reaction off of one of the others. Drugs have that same effect. So the causal link of the desire then of what's called drug-seeking behaviors that go with the cravings is different for different drug levels. So in that sense, no, the other things are not relevant. The brain is just saying, hey, go get more of this. And some drugs say that stronger, longer, harder than others. The other two are absolutely valid, and I said those are my points from the larger kind of systemic understanding of what got that person there, what stops that person from getting into healing, which is called recovery, things like that. So does it make sense? So three different kind of parts to it. Yep.
Okay, I just want to get clear on that.
But the last one is really more like a clinical thing, but that clinical, the brain is driving all of us, and that's what gets into the criminal behavior art of it, whether, regardless. The first two are the bigger lenses through which absolutely things now need to be understood that we didn't, look at it very often 20, 30 years ago that way.
And a follow-up question to that, when you talk about stronger, longer, and harder in terms of how it impacts the brain.
Yeah.
So this task force is looking at people who have served an extraordinarily long period of time.
Yep.
And therefore have been abstinent from drugs.
Sure.
So is the wiring of the brain still impacted after 10, 20, 30 years?
It can be. The rewiring doesn't undo itself, right? You think about any kind of neural impact, the rewiring does not undo itself necessarily. If they've been able to be in program that's evidence-based program, I hate to say words like that, but evidence-based programming that has done some of that rewiring. I talked about cognitive behavioral therapy, I talked about contingency management, and I think it was, Daniel talked also on the mental health side there. If some of that was in place, it might be. The big thing is if none of that was in place, while the person is abstinent, again, we didn't know this 20 to 30 years ago. We thought you're released. You've been abstinent for a long time, and let's assume you have been. All's good and magical. We now know from brain scanning and from lots of data that, in fact, that to that brain, it says, good, I'm out of this. Let's go get drugs right here, right now. And Senator Peters, your question, and I appreciate your question, that's where the criminogenic factor comes in, to be sure. So someone for whom, like methamphetamine, very powerful drug, after one use, most of us would be like, I want more of that. Everybody's an individual, respect all that. Alcohol, we all have whatever your experience with that. So Heather, the question is, we should assume that if no program was in place, we should assume that that person, in fact, goes right back to when they last used. They're right back there when they're released. Doesn't mean it will be, but you should assume that. If they've had good evidence-based programming in place, they still need specialized case management, they still need support, pre-post, all that stuff, they should get better outcomes, generally speaking. Does that give you a clear enough answer? I try not to be too conceptual. Yep. Yeah, it's good. That's good. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, let's just play it out. If someone's coming out of being incarcerated, the environment and space that they're going into, so neighborhood, town,
Matters.
including matters.
People, places, and things matters greatly.
How much does it matter?
Yeah, we don't know the
I
answer.
don't even know the answer about that. I
Yeah.
gotta make sure that, I don't wanna speak for you. What do you
Yeah,
think?
we don't know the answer. What we know now is that nature and nurture both matter. The nature is the genetic loading, but the nurture matters greatly. So here's what we do know. That if someone comes out and they've been abstinent, right? They're in prison, they've been abstinent, they were using drugs before. If they come out and they're not exposed to drugs, that reduces the likelihood of them going back. If they go into a home where drug use is not accepted and pro-social behaviors are in place, they're less likely to come back. Those are called protective factors that we do know. There are no percentages on it that I've seen that would be considered credible. We know what makes it more likely and less likely for success, which we didn't fully understand, by the way, 20 to 30 years ago. It sounds odd, but we didn't fully grasp it. So I'm sorry, Senator Peters, I can't give you an answer. What I can tell you is those factors matter. And so if anybody, no matter where they are, institution otherwise, has drug use in their past and has clinical addiction, in other words, that they were addicted, it's there, it's real. And for them and their families and the children and any home they're going to be in any community, if that stuff's present, you should expect that they will go back to drug use. I'm not broad brushing it. I'm saying you should plan and put resources in place to mitigate that. Things like specialized case management, things like medications, and when they went in, didn't exist. If those are, appropriate for them, we know that now. We didn't know it then. So best answer I can give you, and I wish I had a good answer, Senator Peters. Like, oh, it's 17% this, 32% that. We don't know. We know the range of items. We just don't know like the percentages on them. Does that help at all, or give something?
Yeah, I mean, my college question is one that's just too intense. I was gonna say, if you throw somebody in Winnetka compared to if you throw them in South Shore, might be the fact that there's this higher level of investment and factors that can help boost somebody in a situation. But that's me.
I understand.
A hypothesis based off of.
Yeah, you're talking through a very large systemic lens, possibly an equity lens, a resource lens.
This is not what
Absolutely.
this is about.
Yeah, no, I get it. I get the question you're asking. Yeah. What I will say though, that whether it's the home in Winnetka or South Shore, if there's drugs in that home, and they might be equally chance that there's drugs in that home, it's a bad place for them to go. Let me say that.
Okay.
All right, there's drugs in rich people's homes, like there are also. They just are looked at differently, right? So I want to be
So can I comment on that question? It's a great question. I think you're asking about the economic impact. It doesn't cost anything to be psychotic, but it's expensive to have drug use. And so there's an economic factor. And it's absolutely true that it's a hereditary disease. There's no doubt. So the question you have, kind of a thought experiment, is what if you legalize, made drugs available, take out the economic aspect, you still need treatment. You still need to have these treatment is it Jack or Jacques? Jack. Is Jack that Jack said. So, and you can look at other countries that have legalized. Look at Portugal, for example. That would be a good example.
Other questions?
I'd like to ask Dr. Johanna to talk a little bit about medication and your work with folks who are on parole, because we hear a lot about an inability or an unwillingness to comply with medication protocol.
Sure. So people with schizophrenia and others, some with bipolar illness, with psychotic disorders, as part of the disease, they don't recognize that they're ill. It's a phenomena called anosognosia. So that's the technical term. And we see that in stroke victims, for example. When certain parts of the brain are affected, you ask them to raise their left arm, they stays on their side, and they say, sure, I'm raising it. So they can't recognize they're ill. And that's part of the disease of schizophrenia and bipolar for many. So we one of the things we are working on in the state is to improve education and use of involuntary treatment. You have to go to court. They have to be, a court has to approve medications. And today we're using primarily for this group intramuscular medications that you give once a month. And without that, you're right, it's going to be very difficult for people to, if they don't think that they have a problem, to accept medication. So that's what we would recommend. So as people who had psychotic disorders, are on antipsychotics that we've evaluated that say are in prison and are going to be discharged, they should be on intramuscular antipsychotics if that's what they need, because then you know they get it. Does that help, Kathy?
So they come to your clinic, they get a shot. and
They get a shot. Yeah.
It lasts for a month.
It lasts for a month. In fact, there's now drugs that last 3 months. Invega Trinza, which is paliperidone. And they just came out with one that lasts a year. Now, wow. I don't love those because, you know, if you have side effects, well, you're in trouble for a year. So I like the monthly because we get to see somebody, you know, at least somebody gets to see them. And injections can be done anywhere. And in Illinois, actually pharmacists can give these. They don't love it, but you know, with permission and our evaluation and an order, they can give these injections. So, and people give it at home. You know, they have somebody who can give it. So that's the recommendation for those treatment, and it's because they don't recognize they're ill.
And I'd like to jump in as a moderator. I'll just take moderator privilege. So Thresholds obviously serves people with serious mental illness, and we also provide what is called assertive community treatment that Dr. Johanna mentioned. And assertive community treatment for people who have schizophrenia, severe schizoaffective disorder, severe bipolar. This treatment approach includes psychiatry. We literally check on people sometimes literally every single day. We are helping them not just take their medications, which can be long-acting injectables, which Dr. Johanna mentioned, that can keep people more medication compliant, and keep their symptoms under control. But it also surrounds them with what the services that Dr. Johanna were talking about, which is the vast majority of it is case management to help people with the social determinants of health. Because when people are transitioning from incarceration back to their community, it's a very challenging process. And having a team of folks that are part of the assertive community treatment team can be really crucial in supporting them when they have housing challenges or challenges getting food or just challenges in re-socializing in a different environment. So there are treatment approaches that help people make this transition and help them manage every single day. So just wanted to, it's not just about medication, it is about supporting people's needs in the community as well as housing.
Agreed.
So from what I'm hearing, and I guess I already know this, but it's kind of been reinforced today, is that our charge as a task force, as a commission, is two-pronged. First of all, evaluating the individual to ensure that they're in the best place that they can be in order to be in position to be released. And then secondly, providing, and I think this is where the senator was kind of going, is making sure that and you just mentioned it, Heather, making sure that the services in totality are available to give them the greatest chance at being successful on the outside. And that's not just about the individual, that's about the community as a whole, because that person was incarcerated for a reason. And while they've been there for an excessive amount of time, on a large amount of time, like I said, we don't want to set them up to fail. You know, as good as they are to be ready to come out, if those services that they actually need are not available to them in the community, and when that there'll be natural resources to somebody going home to Winnetka rather than the south side of Chicago. So that's where the equity comes into play.
Yeah.
It's not the equality, but the equity that comes into play. I'm gonna give you what you need so that the resources you have are equivalent to somebody that lives in Winnetka. And that's what in my belief is, that's what our argument has to be, in that if this is gonna be successful, and we're trying to get the results that we actually want, we gotta ensure that that equity exists in all areas here, and that we provide the resources as a community so that this individual is successful, and at the end of the day, we all win as a result of that.
Yeah. I agree. I would also say though, as Chief Davis mentioned, we can't wait to provide the types of resources that are needed for this endeavor when a decision has been made to resentence an individual, right? Like that has to start while they're still in the Illinois Department of Corrections, preparing them, because if they've been in for a long extended amount of time, then they need a period of preparation. We are preparing them for failure if we're just saying, oh, today you're ready for release, and they have not had the opportunity to participate in the things that they have been missing being outside of the world that we live in for an extended period of time. I've met people within the Illinois Department of Corrections who have been in there, and there were no iPhones and all of these other things. So we're having conversations to them about all these technologies that are now, you're not going to look for a job this way. You're going to look for a job this way now, right? There's a whole different world. And we can't expect people to be successful just popping them into that world. Right. There has to be a period or opportunities for preparation. And in order for more people to have the opportunities for preparation, there has to be additional resources that are, or additional agencies that are providing those resources to the individuals in the Illinois Department of Corrections.
May I say something on that? Is that okay? So
Sure.
You've heard both health. I'm from the drug side. I'm kind of called the drug guy. I say I'm not that drug guy, but I'm from the drug side. Get the mental health folks. There's a commonality in what we're both saying, that is a resource that is extremely critical. Again, going back to this theme of what we did not know 20 to 30 years ago, and that is, you hear us using the phrase case management or specialized case management, both in and out. That is a force. I was in the Army. That is a force multiplier, or if you like the McDonald's version of it, that is supersizing the ability for successful reentry for populations. We now know in the United States unequivocally how to reenter someone from prison safely into the community, safely for them and safely for the community. We now know how to do it, and one of the key elements is specialized case management. In addition to, drug treatment, mental health treatment, medications, those things matter, but the specialized case management that can go the distance with that person, a year out, 2 years out, cheap, not that expensive, huge, massive outcome increase off of just the other things happening. And I want to hit that to your point, Chief Hughes, and I hope my mental health colleagues, I think, will agree with me that that is a big, big part of what we never used to know or do. They release you, you're done, you're gone, and we got the outcomes that everybody knew was coming. We just didn't know how to undo it. Yep. I don't mean to speak for you, Heather, or if you're not. Yeah.
I realize that there may be some geographic differences, but annually, what does it cost to monitor this person, freedom 6 back into society?
Well, I don't have DLC stats. I don't know what it used to be this big comparison of treatment in Illinois, and it's every state you go in, it's different. $7,000. No, this is just treatment, right? $7,000 for treatment, and DLC is $40,000 a year to hold someone in. So on top of that, you probably add $3,000-4,000 a year for some kind of case management. I don't know if the mental health world. Yeah, I know what you're asking. Yeah.
For assertive community treatment, which is really a holistic treatment, it's about $15,000 to $16,000 a year. There's a step down model called community support team treatment that is probably about $13,000. I mean, just the rates have changed, so I don't have the new numbers,
Yeah.
but that's a ballpark.
We have a hand raised, Colin Mosley. Colin, go ahead.
Yeah, hey, I've got to jump off here in a minute for another meeting. So I just wanted to express a couple things before I get off. First and foremost, just a vested interest that we have in this, and I'm happy to be here on Darren's behalf because, you know, my dad's a lieutenant at Centralia Prison. My grandpa works for the Police Training Board under Chief Davis. His name's Lee Riker. I don't know if you know him or not, but so just happy to be here. And I just want to say that on the senator's behalf, one of the most important points that we're highlighting today that I'm happy to hear on discussion is how important it is, not only preparation wise, you know, for the person who's going to be, you know, reentering, but also community and preparing them to receive them, you know, I think wholeheartedly with all the resources available to them. And talk about equity, you know, and I'm probably 4 hours south of most of you right now. And we want to be able to have those exact same opportunities here to do it as everyone else across the state too. So that's our kind of priority right now, is making sure that we can be a part of this wholeheartedly to receive them in the community just as much as anywhere else, and make it successful for them and for the community as a whole. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Colin.
So I think another part that we have to make sure that we include in this is a very broad educational effort for everybody in the community. And I'm not going to just say stakeholders, because some people don't know their stakeholders. You don't know what you don't know. And I use myself as an example. I was at a regional conference a few years ago for Noble, and there was a lady that did a presentation on reentry. And that's when the session began, I was one of those, what the heck is she talking to us for as police chiefs about reentry? But it was an amazing presentation. And by the time she got done, I just felt like I felt so bad that I didn't know that I didn't realize the role that I played as a police executive in reentry. And, you know, she just this lady actually, President Obama actually ended up bringing her to his administration. But I didn't realize, and those of you who know me know that, hey, I'm all about this. And the fact that I didn't realize it means that there are a lot of folks out there that don't realize that they play a part in this, and to what extent they play a part in this process, and making sure and ensuring that it is successful. So I think that education piece, and once again, not to say stakeholders, because I didn't realize I was a stakeholder in reentry at the time, but to educate everybody that if we're going to make this work, we're going to need everybody's input, and everybody plays a part. And once again, I say it again, we'll all win in the end if we all accept responsibility.
I just want to let folks know that Danielle needed to leave. She had let me know that she had a firm commitment 11, so she didn't want to interrupt the conversation, but wanted to gracefully depart. So
Thanks. I'd like to throw a question out for consideration. And in a way, it's a devil's advocate question. I think we have at least, well, I will say 23 years of evidence, because that's how long I've been doing criminal justice policy work, that the resources are not going to be forthcoming to the extent that we need them to be. It's taken Threshold's 10 years, I've known Heather for 10, to get the Medicaid reimbursement increase. So this is what troubles me. A person who's been in prison for 20 years, and I've, in my very deep past, represented people who came out of prison after 20 years with zero in terms of reentry services, and they did okay because they had their families primarily. I find it troubling to think that we will keep folks who have that skill set that Danielle described, who have been compliant in prison, who have wanted to do programming, but maybe not have been able to access it because the resources at DOC did not allow DOC to provide it. I find it troubling to think that we might end up with some people perceiving that it's okay to keep them in prison if the resources aren't out there. And the other thing that I want to kind of put with that is we don't have great representation on this body of the people who are in the trenches serving the people who come out of DOC, whether there's resources or not. I mean, there's, I think, 6 justice hubs now in the city of Chicago, and they're being replicated elsewhere. So, you know, I think at what point do we kind of get to the point where if we're going to have a resentencing motion in a court with a decision maker who is used to considering evidence and making a decision, I think that where our focus needs to be is what kind of evidence do we want to make sure they consider, and how we look at a person's ability to access that evidence and have it considered fairly. And what really struck me, one of the things about what Danielle said, and I will say that our last SPAC meeting we did on restorative justice, so that's kind of front and center in my mind. If this process has the ability to include a restorative justice opportunity for those victims, that might be the single most important thing we can do to address the harm and provide the entree to healing. So I'd like to hear from you, from the members. We're not going to have the resources anytime soon to serve the number of people who are coming out of DOC. We're not, because that's how we roll. We've made progress, don't get me wrong. We've funded trauma services. We have grant programs that fund trauma services that are pretty onerous to get the money out of, but we have them. So setting the resources aside, how do we figure this out? What do we want to consider? Joby has raised her hand. I don't know if I assume you're responding.
Well, yeah, I want to encourage this. This is the conversation, Kathy, what you just asked. I think this is the nut that comes from today's presentations is we are not going to magically change the what we all know who've been in this for a while, the level of resources. So I agree, and I'm just hoping that this is a really fantastic group of people we have assembled for this task force. And there's only 20 minutes left in this meeting, but I just want to encourage people to really wrestle with this, and maybe we can carve out some more time at our next meeting after we've had some time to think about how we want to address that, because I think that's right. It terrifies me that we would prevent someone from regaining liberty and community because we don't have the money to give them training or to give them resources that they may need, but that they may not need, and or totally require in order to succeed as free people.
I think the aha moment for me today was listening to Danielle and giving the perspective of, and I never thought about it that way, is that's the most challenging environment to not be violent in. And that, so for me, I'll use this analogy. So in law enforcement, we hire 2 types of officers. We have entry-level officers, and then we have lateral transfers. Lateral transfers are people who have already been police officers somewhere else, and they're just coming to your police department. I love lateral transfers because they've already been the police, and I know how they're going to operate as a police officer. Good, bad, or indifferent, I can just look at their history and being in that environment. And that helps me decide whether or not I'm going to hire them. And so a new person, they're coming in and you don't know how they're going to develop as an officer. So I love lateral hires. And it's kind of the same type of thing that that person been existing for 20 years in the most challenging environment that exists to not be violent. If they, it maybe even started off that maybe they were, but in current years, if they've grown to some point to the fact that they have not shown that propensity for violence, if that's our concern is them being violent in society, that having a way to most accurately track that while they're in custody, I think is very important so that can be a consideration for the individual as to whether or not they should even be put into that category of being considered. And as far as the resources are concerned, you know, I'm in complete agreement that, you know, we're talking about, we were having conversation as though we were in an ideal society, and that's just not close. It is what it is. And so while we can, I think we still come up with a formula for success, and we do the best we can with what we have. But before you even enter that process, we look at you as an individual to ensure that, you know what, this person is ready to be entered into that process.
Thank you. I see Director Jeffries' hand is up.
Yes, just to piggyback on what Kathy and Joby spoke on, I'm in the reality. I know what we have and what we don't have. But to that point is it's important to have the transition. We have to have that ability to have them when they're released. They have to have resources available for them. That's just, we have to have wraparound because we have to address their needs and what have you, because if not, then we are setting them up for failure, because just releasing people and not having them a place to go or, you know, to receive services in the community, I don't know what's even better, because they'll come back. So I just want to raise that up and make sure that if we're not worried about the inside resources, we need to worry about what is the transitional plan, what is the reentry plan, how's that case management out in the community to ensure that some of these long-term offenders, I'm speaking in particular about the SMI population, quite frankly, because we struggle now with that. So I see the reality right now that we can't find placement for those folks with my released authority.
Good points. Joby, is your hand still up? Joby, I see your hand. I don't know if you just didn't take it down or if you have it up again.
I'm sorry about that. No, I just forgot to take it down. My apologies.
Okay.
Can I say, I'm not on the task force, but can I just add one piece to Director Jeffrey's comment? A lot of this discussion has been around the services, but particularly for people with serious mental illnesses, housing has to be a factor, because without housing, people cannot take care of their serious illness in a shelter. So I just want to put that on the table.
Okay, do we have anybody else who'd like to chime in?
That's another population we struggle with now as well too, and we experienced that during the pandemic, was the aging population. You know, we try to get folks out on medical furlough, but there was no place for them to go. So I spoke earlier about getting other state agencies involved with this task. I think that's where there's a whole lot more in-house resources that we can utilize as opposed to just outsourcing things. So there's state agencies that can be part of this discussion as well too. That's a hint. That's a hint.
Okay,
There
Scott,
is a
I see your. Heather, was that you? I'm sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, and then I'll stop. There is a program, it's called the Housing as Recovery Program. It's legislation that passed 2 years ago. That would be a housing subsidy that would include people coming out of DOC facilities with serious mental illnesses or severe severe substance use disorders, that would be virtually a permanent housing subsidy until another subsidy becomes available. There's only $10 million behind it, but if it is successful, it is an avenue into housing and services for the population you're talking about.
All right, Scott, I saw your hand.
Yeah, and so I do love keeping a schedule, so I don't want to delay our conversation. And I'm nervous because, I'm showing to be a bad lawyer because I may ask the director a question without knowing the answer. But to your point in terms of ensuring wraparound services for people as they're coming out, like one of the many things that jumped out at me from today's conversation was the numbers that you indicated in terms of release during the time of COVID, of the 4,000 individuals that were released early, and only 160, like a small percentage that wound up back in custody. Like, I guess the question I had is, were we really thinking that those 4,000 people coming out had that complete wraparound services, or is it just the reality that, sometimes the better action is to allow someone to re-enter society, and there's there is a hope, but not always a certainty that we can assure that those services are available and still have positive results.
Scott, to your point, I could have released 7,000 if I had what I'm talking about right now. There's some folks I just could not find placement for. And then you have the aging population where I couldn't put them in a placement to where, their medical needs were being met because all their family was dead. I know that was kind of harsh, but they were deceased. I guess I should change the word up. And then there was, so there is a need. I mean, I can't speak enough about what I currently have right now of people I can't get out that should be out because I don't have those services, or I don't have the housing for them because of, the law or what have you.
Thank you, Director.
Okay, in keeping with our schedule, why don't we move on?
Well, we've
Susan?
gotten information and guidance from this panel. And I'm sure I speak for everyone here when I thank the three presenters and Heather for moderating. That guidance is terrific. And now Judge Salone is going to give us some guidance of another kind and talk to us about principles that we should be bearing in mind as we go forward in the work of the Resentencing Task Force.
Thank you. In light of conversation in the past 3 minutes or so, the task seems ominous. Question I believe we have to resolve: when is enough enough? And it sounds like a oracle question, but it's not. That's part of what the task force constituted or charged with identifying. Hopefully we'll be able to formulate the framework to answer that question. I hope that you've all had an opportunity to look at the principles that are being proposed. These principles are the product of the various advocacy groups and the stakeholders in the criminal justice community. These are not final proposals, designed to stimulate the conversation that we've had here. We welcome your comments, and hopefully you'll be able to memorialize comments not later than the end of this month. Get those to the staff. By the way, they've done an excellent job thus far. But let's look at very briefly the principles in question. Number one, the inquiry should be whether the purposes of sentencing embodied in the Illinois Constitution and the interest of justice based on current circumstances of the individual and the victim of the crime of conviction, changes in law, policy, and scientific knowledge would be better served by a modified sentence than the petitioner's completion of the original sentence. And we heard about the advances that the legal community is making, that behavioral sciences are now revealing to us. So, suggests to me that we certainly want to promote this consideration. Article 1, Section 11 of the Illinois Constitution reads in relevant part, all penalties shall be determined both according to the seriousness of the offense and with the objective of restoring the offender to useful citizenship. No convictions shall work corruption of blood or forfeiture of the state. That's powerful language, and I don't know that we, practical purposes, pay attention to it or attempt to reach that mandate. But the resentencing provision would begin to do that. And by the way, it is my understanding that Illinois is one of 4 or 5 states with such proposed legislation. We're on the cutting edge. Second principle reads as follows. Authorize a fair, consistent, and proportionate mechanism for judicial review and specify the criteria for eligibility and identify the people or entities that can file petitions for resentencing. I think it's straightforward. Question of fairness, proportionate mechanisms you have to work through. But principle, I don't know how anyone could have any objection to the concept. Number 3, specify the time frame in which the right to reapply after initial eligibility shall occur. For example, successive petitions can be brought every 3 to 5 years. So the petitioner needs to know his or her time frame bringing this. Number 4 reads, specify how individuals who are incarcerated shall be notified of their right to file petitions and have adequate assistance for the preparation of the petitions may be provided by counsel or non-lawyers. Now, I would imagine that he would also include social workers within the Illinois Department of Correction. And of course, there are advocacy groups that end as well. Yeah. Oh. Okay, share it with us.
That's okay.
All right. Number 5, provide for procedures to screen and dismiss applications that lack merit on their face. We heard, if, for example, there is a history of violence while incarcerated. So surely it seems that there would be certain criteria that, or behavior that would eliminate on their face certain applications. Number 6, the judicial decision maker shall be authorized to modify any aspect of the original sentence so long as the portion of the modified sentence to be served is no more severe than the remainder of the original sentence. Sentence modification authority under this provision shall not be limited by any mandatory minimum terms of imprisonment or mandatory sentence enhancements under state law. I discussed just very briefly portions of this principle with Kathy, and I called to her attention, and I forgot to follow up, that Judge Sachs quoted in it, Judge Stanley Sachs here in Cook County, was quoted in the Sun-Times article, I believe it was Sun-Times, taking exception concept of research. I don't recall how that matter was brought to him, but the article was, it was a full page. And I don't think that Judge Sachs would think there will be others who would share his opinion. We tend to be territorial about, our rulings. So that's an issue that, in addition to funding, we'll have to take up as well. The next is number 7, victims shall be notified resentencing proceedings, if they can be located with reasonable effort. The judicial decision maker may consider any victim impact evidence offered in the original sentencing, and victims may be afforded an opportunity to submit a supplemental impact statement limited to changed circumstances since the original sentence. Victims shall also be informed for restorative justice processes available to them either through local authorities or the IDOC. And so, So we heard about impact of sentencing on the victims, and I'm glad that that whole subject was touched on by our first speaker. And it's the reason why I think why we have to have. But of course, our advocacy, the victim impact advocacy groups should be heard as well. Present, the victims group. Comment? Number 8, the prosecuting authority shall be properly served with a motion for resentencing and be given a reasonable time in which to respond. Process. Number 9, an adequate record of the proceedings shall be maintained. The judicial decision maker shall be required to state in the order resolving the petition the reasons for its decision to either grant or deny release. It makes sense to permit the petitioner to address those issues at a later date. And there shall be a mechanism for review of decisions under this provision, which may be discretionary or mandatory to ensure the process is fair. That will take some conversation, a meeting of the minds about what fair is. Number 11, the legislation shall set forth the authority for retroactive application of the resentencing procedure to individuals who were sentenced before its effective date. And we saw that during Trump's administration, where concept was applied retroactively to a number of drug defendants. And it seems only fair to me. And of course, again, every point is subject to debate. But what we'd ultimately like to do, present a unified proposal, one that we've kicked around, given serious consideration to, from all aspects, one that each one of us can stand behind, should that. Last but not least, provide for collection of data to support analysis of the process and outcomes of the resentencing process. court shall provide copies of its orders, both granting and denying relief, to the Sentencing Policy Advisory Council. That's obviously true going forward. Questions? Comments? So we would like, for those of you who are so inclined, to forward your comments, proposals to staff. I think it's the 26th of this month, not later than the 26th of June, so that Katie and her fantastic staff can incorporate your thoughts for our final draft. Questions?
I know we already probably have it, but what's the email? Who we should be directing it to?
You can send feedback to either Mike Elliott, who sends you the notifications for the meetings, or to me, Kathy.saltmarsh@illinois.gov. We'll send that out in an email to all of you, so you have both he and I. And we're also happy to do a call if you want to do a call.
Public comment?
Are there any comments?
I am not seeing any hands. If you're a member of the public and you want to say something, please feel free to unmute and speak up. Well, I see no hands and I hear nobody unmuting, so I think we do not have any public comment. So, whoops.
Kathy, why don't you bring this meeting to a close?
Okay. Can I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
And all in favor?
Aye.
All right, thank you all. And we will be getting back together in July for another robust conversation. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Oh, the comment.